All right, well, welcome to Sunday School Part 4. This is a long series. In fact, it's one of the longest, probably the longest, we've ever done as a church. And the reason for that is that this is an important series. This is a series all about the stories of the Christian faith, the hallmark accounts of our Christian history. That if you grew up in church, you learned in Sunday school, but if you didn't grow up going to Sunday school, because we don't talk about these stories with adults very much, you might, some of you, if you came to faith as an adult, you may have never heard some of these, but they're important for us to learn. I think sometimes we don't talk about them just because in our sermons, we like to be really practical, and so we go straight to Paul's letters that tell us, live this way, don't live that way, and it's very clear for us, cut and dry, here's what you do, here's what you don't do. But I believe that these stories are also deeply practical. We just have to think about them and let them hit our heart a little bit more intentionally. So thank you for joining us in that journey of learning how these stories can impact our lives. And I believe that one of the most important lessons we learn from them is just God's faithfulness throughout history. And in this time in history, in 2020, when so much is just weird and wonky and unexpected, there's a lot that we can learn from seeing these stories of how God has been faithful throughout history, these true stories of God's faithfulness to real people like you and I. Last week we learned about a guy named Job who lived, he's one of the oldest characters in the Bible, and he lived in a land named Ur, and he was called a righteous man. God called him an upright and righteous man, which means he was trustworthy. He did his best to live according to God's law and to please God. In terms of being a good person, think Mother Teresa. But he was also very, very wealthy, and God had blessed him. And so in terms of wealth, think Jeff Bezos. The Bible says he was the wealthiest of anyone in the area of the world that he lived. But basically overnight, in one day, he lost everything he owned and 10 of his children. His life came crashing to the ground. And in a flurry of questions, the story of Job has the most questions of any book of the Bible, which is natural considering how suffering and things falling apart in our life tends to lead to questions. It did for Job. And so with more questions than any other book in the Bible, we're led through chapter after chapter after chapter of questions about why is this happening? His friends asking, why did this happen? Did you do something wrong? God comes in with an answer that we learned last week that helps us when we don't know the answers to what's going on in our life. And it's simply this: what is unknown to me is not unknown to God. I'd encourage you to go and catch up on that message on our website. That, along with the other two, are available for free forever on our website, forterra.church. The first two we learned about through creation in the fall, and then Noah's flood. In week 1, we learned that God created the world with purpose and on purpose, which is different from what the versions of origin stories were at the time that it was written when Moses wrote it. And it's also different than the stories that we're told in our culture of how we came to be through random chance. The Bible says that no, we were created with purpose and on purpose. And even though the world looks broken now, when God made it, He called it very good. But we learned that sin came in and made it very bad. And so God offered a promise through Adam and Eve that through the offspring of a woman, there would be someone who would come one day that would help to make everything right again. And we learned that person one day would come through Mary, and his name would be Jesus. And then we learned that the story of Jesus was given to us in a picture form, almost like an allegory, but in the form of a true story that still painted the picture of Jesus in the story of Noah and the ark and the global flood. And we learned that in Noah's story, the whole world was saved through one man in a wooden boat, but in Jesus' story, the whole world is saved through one man on a wooden cross. Today we're getting back into Genesis after taking a break to look at Job. We're back in Genesis and we're learning about the story of Joseph. But before we can get to him, we have to learn who he is, where he comes from, and why he matters in the grand story of the Bible. And so as we get out of the story of Noah's Ark and the flood, if you recall back a couple weeks ago, there's a story that comes quickly on the heels of that known as the Tower of Babel. And basically everyone on earth spoke the same language, of course, right? In fact, even secular science agrees that at one point all humanity spoke one language. But God had given humanity a very specific command. He said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Well, they weren't filling the earth. They were grouping together into one place, and they all spoke one language, and so that wasn't a problem for them. And they weren't really multiplying either. They were just multiplying their wealth and building a giant tower to make a great name for themselves. Well, that didn't work out very well for them. God confused their language so that they would actually do what He commanded them to do and fill the earth. And out of that scattering, we pick up into the story of a family that the rest of the entire Old Testament focuses on. But it sets a pattern where basically what we see throughout almost the entire Old Testament, but especially in Genesis, is that God makes something good. Humanity corrupts it and breaks it and makes it very bad with sin. And then God comes in and fixes it and makes it good again. And that cycle repeats over and over. After the flood, it happened with the Tower of Babel, with the scattering of everyone. And out of that scattering, we zoom in on one family that the rest of the Old Testament focuses on from that point out. And it traces the genealogy of that family that leads to Abram, later known as Abraham. And so Genesis looks at Abraham's life, and God had called him to leave his home and go to a land named Canaan. And God says that in Canaan, He's going to give him that land, and He's going to turn him into a great nation and give him a great name. He made him two promises. I'm going to make your name great, and I'm going to bless you and turn you into a nation. And those promises were connected to earlier parts of Genesis. One at the Tower of Babel, when humans sought to make a great name for themselves, and it didn't go very well. The great name wasn't the issue. God promises to give a great name to Abraham. So the great name isn't the issue. The issue is that God is the giver of greatness, not us. And so to prove that, God promises to make a great name for a no name, Abraham, with the goal of bringing back some of the blessing that God gave to Adam and Eve when He placed them in the garden in the beginning. But why? Why did God make these promises to Abraham? Well, it says that it was so that in this one family, in Abraham's family, that all the rest of the world would be blessed through them. It wasn't just for them. Genesis 12:3, God says to Abraham, "In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And this is key to the rest of the story. God created a very good world, and humanity made it very bad through sin. And God's plan is to rescue His rebellious and broken world through this one family. And the entire rest of the Old Testament focuses on this one family and their descendants who eventually become the kingdom or nation of Israel. And that's also why Israel is called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. We're going to learn more about that next week. But they were called a kingdom of priests because their job as a nation was to show the rest of the world what God is like and to bless the rest of the world. And so all the promises of God, the blessing and the great nation and everything, were going to be fulfilled through this nation, through this family, and through the coming of a messianic king who would come to make everything right again. But none of that is clear at this point in Genesis where we're at today. So we have to keep going through the story. The rest of this book focuses on Abraham and his family. First Abraham, then his son Isaac, then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons, including Joseph, who is our focus for today. And every generation of Abraham's family is marked by two themes. Every generation is united by two themes. Number one, every generation is marked by repeated failure that puts God's promise in jeopardy. And number two, God remains faithful to them in spite of that. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reminding them of his promise to bless them and to bless the rest of the world through them. And so starting with Abraham, he's promised a huge family. But twice in his life, he fears for his own life because powerful men are attracted to his wife. And so he pretends that he's not married to her so that they don't kill him in order to get her. But that creates all kinds of problems in the family. But the promise to have a big family is still there, and his wife Sarah still can't have children. They've tried, and it just isn't happening. And so Sarah and Abraham agree that he should sleep with their servant girl, and she can have a baby for them. And that just creates even more problems. But every time, God bails Abraham out of those problems, and he keeps his promise to Abraham, not because Abraham deserved it, but because God is that good. And so one night, it's a classic part of Abraham's life story. God takes him out under the stars, and he says, look up at the stars. See if you can count them. Your descendants will outnumber those stars. Now, that was before light pollution. So imagine being out in the country instead of the city. That's the kind of view that Abraham was seeing, and that's the kind of promise that God gave him. And so in spite of not being able to have kids with Sarah, in spite of all the obstacles in his way and not having any kids yet, and he's getting old, he still trusts God. Eventually, God makes good on the promise, and he has some children, and he dies at a really old age, and one of his children's name is Isaac. Now, Isaac has two sons named Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's name means deceiver, and he lives up to that name because he ends up stealing his older brother Esau's birthright, his inheritance, by tricking his old blind father Isaac while he's on his deathbed. Real bad move. And then he just pieces out with the inheritance, and he goes and he marries 4 women, even though he only loved one of them. And that creates rivalries in the family. And finally, Jacob is humbled after a life of deceit and sinfulness. He's humbled when his uncle Laban cheats him out of years of his labor. Kind of came full circle. So a humbled Jacob returns home, having lost nearly everything. And in a strange story, Jacob wrestles with God. And it might sound a little weird, but Jacob, when he's wrestling with God, says he's basically, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. He says, I'm wrestling and I'm demanding that you give a blessing. And as weird as it sounds, God actually grants his request. He honors his determination and offers him the same blessing that he had offered to Abraham, to make him into a great nation. And he changes Jacob's name to Israel. And that's why the nation of Israel is named what it's named. And Israel means wrestles with God. And so then the story shifts to Jacob's sons. And one of them is Joseph, and that's who we're going to focus the rest of our time on today. Jacob loves his son Joseph more than his other 12 sons, which creates, again, more family problems. Joseph's brothers hated him because of this. And so on top of being dad's favorite, they also hated Joseph because of his dreams. Joseph had 2 dreams. In one dream, he's working the field with his brothers, and they're gathering wheat. And suddenly Joseph's bundle of wheat stands up, and all of his brothers' bundles of wheat gather around and bow down to Joseph's bundle of wheat. Well, his brothers didn't like the sound of that, nor the sound of the next dream, in which 12 stars and the sun and moon, representing the brothers and parents, they all bow down to Joseph as well, and they hated him even more because of that. But things got really bad when Jacob's favoritism for Joseph became painfully obvious because of a gift that he gave to Joseph. He gave Joseph a colorful coat, or a tunic or robe, depending on what translation you read. It was a very nice and expensive robe, nicer than anything that Jacob had ever given to the other brothers, kind of like when your parents gave your younger sibling a car that was nicer than anything you ever got. So Jacob's older brothers hated him, and they hated him so much that they wanted to kill him. And so one day when Joseph was going out to meet his brothers in the field to help them work the animals, they see him coming and they plot to kill him. And so they catch him and they throw him into an empty cistern. And while he's down there, Reuben, one of the brothers, says, hey, we should probably not kill him. Instead, let's sell him as a slave. So Reuben saves his brother's life, but he's still sold as a slave, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. But now they had the problem of a missing brother, and so they took the colorful coat that Jacob had given to Joseph and they dipped it in goat's blood and gave it to their father Jacob and said, "Look at it. See, a wild animal has devoured Joseph." And so Jacob believed that Joseph was dead. But as a slave in Egypt, he worked hard for his master Potiphar, and Potiphar loved him and put him in charge of his whole household. But then Potiphar's wife was lonely and bored, and she started trying to seduce Joseph. And he refused. Over and over and over he refused. But one day he was alone in the house with Potiphar's wife, and she grabbed on to his cloak, and he realized what she was doing, and so he fled, and leaving his cloak just in her hands. But then she accused him falsely of rape. And so Potiphar threw him in prison. And he ends up in prison with two of Pharaoh's servants who had been thrown into prison. Pharaoh's baker and Pharaoh's cupbearer. And while he's in prison with them, they have dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams for them, and the interpretations come true. The baker ends up dying, and the cupbearer goes free and goes and works for Pharaoh again. Well, eventually, the Pharaoh had a dream that he didn't understand, and none of the Egyptian conjurers could interpret it for him. And so then the cupbearer goes, "Hey, while I was in prison, there was this guy, Joseph, who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and they both came true." And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph and has him brought to him out of prison. And Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream and tells him, "Hey, your dream means that there's going to be a bad famine that comes to Egypt, and you need to prepare as a nation, or else you're going to have a lot of people die of starvation." And Pharaoh is so impressed that he releases him from prison and makes him second in command over all of Egypt and puts him in charge of the effort to collect enough food to last through the upcoming famine. Well, sure enough, the famine comes, and not only did Joseph store up enough food to save Egypt from starving, but it was enough that they were able to sell food to people from other neighboring nations who also experienced the famine, which increased both Egypt and Joseph's wealth. So he was one of the wealthiest and second most powerful man in all of Egypt, after having been sold as a slave, falsely accused, and put into prison. Crazy how that worked out. Well, wouldn't you know that some of the people who experienced the famine that needed to buy food were none other than Joseph's brothers, Jacob's other children. So they come to Egypt to buy food, and when they do, they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them and doesn't let on to it. He just treats them like they're strangers. And he accuses them of being spies so that he can get them to go and get the youngest brother, Benjamin, who hadn't come with them. So they go and get Benjamin, they bring him back. Then he reveals to them who he is and asks them to go get the father, and they have this family reunion, and everything is made right again. And that's Joseph's story in a nutshell. It's a very long story. In fact, it's actually one of the longest stories in the Bible. Genesis spends more time on Joseph than it does on any other person in the book of Genesis. And it is interesting to me to study this with you because Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. In fact, some scholars have counted over 100 ways that Joseph looks like Jesus. We don't have time for that. Other scholars have found 50 ways, just a list of 50. We don't have time for that either. So I've selected a few of the most important and significant ways that Joseph looks like Jesus. The first is that Joseph was uniquely loved by his father. In fact, that's the first thing we learn about him. As soon as we meet Joseph in Genesis, it says, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel," that's Jacob, "loves Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors." So there was a unique love that the father had for his son, that Jacob had for Joseph. And the robe or coat of many colors was thought to be a sign of authority in the household. And so when Jesus first shows up in the banks of the Jordan River to be baptized by John the Baptist, a voice comes from heaven. And here's what it says happened. It says, when Jesus was baptized, immediately when he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Jesus, like Joseph, was uniquely loved by his Father. And remember, if the robe was a symbol of authority, that reminds me of Jesus in Matthew 28 when he says, "And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." The most incredible gift that the Father could give to his Son. But there's another way to look at that colorful coat, because instead of it being translated as colorful, it could also be translated as seamless. Seamless. Maybe both. A seamless, colorful coat. Either way, though, it brings to my mind when Jesus died. It says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So both Jesus and Joseph were uniquely loved by their Father, given authority and a wonderful, wonderful gift. Joseph was hated by his brothers. It says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. And this hatred continues until they sell him into slavery. And that's a lot like Jesus. Jesus was hated. John 1:11 says he came to his own and his own people did not receive him. When Jesus spoke, the common people, they loved him. When he spoke, they understood what he was saying. He didn't talk in the fancy ways that the rabbis did. He spoke in common language that the common man could understand. But because the common people loved him so much, the religious leaders and the elites, they hated him because he threatened their power. And they hated him so much that they wanted to kill him. Just like Joseph. Joseph was also falsely accused. He was falsely accused of trying to rape Potiphar's wife. And similarly, people made up false accusations about Jesus too. In Luke chapter 23, verse 2, it says that they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute or pay taxes to Caesar." This, of course, was untrue. Jesus had actually told people the opposite. He said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." These were false accusations, a lot like Potiphar's accusations against Joseph weren't true either. So both Jesus and Joseph were uniquely loved by their fathers, hated by their brothers, falsely accused, and Joseph was unjustly sold for a little bit of silver. For Joseph, it says that the Midianite traders passed by and they drew Joseph up out of the cistern and lifted him up out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, when Jesus was on the earth, he did ministry with 12 disciples, a lot like how Joseph had 12 brothers. And Joseph's brothers sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And so take a look at what happens to Jesus. It says, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him." So both Jesus and Joseph were betrayed for a small amount of silver by people that they called brothers. They were uniquely loved by their fathers, hated by their brothers, falsely accused, and sold for a little bit of silver. Joseph suffered alongside 2 criminals. He was put in prison with the cupbearer and the baker, who were criminals in the court of Pharaoh. And Jesus was also crucified between 2 criminals. But the similarities actually go deeper than that, because in Joseph's story, the baker dies and the cupbearer lives. One dies and the other lives. Now, while Jesus was on the cross, one of the criminals next to him mocked Jesus, and he blasphemed Jesus. And when he died, he also died spiritually with no promise of eternal life. But the other criminal had a different experience. It says, the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Spiritually, this man got to live. One died and the other lived, just like Joseph and the criminals that he was with. Joseph was dead to his father, but then appeared alive. That's the next way that Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. In Genesis 37:32, starting in 31 actually, it says, "They took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, 'This we have found, liars. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not.' And he identified it and said, 'This is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces.' His father thought he was dead, only to see him alive a short period of time later. This is much like when Jesus died and was buried, and everyone thought that it was over. But then Jesus came back to life a few days later. But more than that, because when Joseph appeared to his brothers, they didn't recognize him. He recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. So check out what happened, Check out what happened when Jesus showed up after he died. It says that Mary went to the tomb where Jesus was buried, and she found it open and empty, and she said, "They have taken away my Lord. I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. She didn't recognize him. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. She didn't recognize him at first. Both Joseph and Jesus appeared alive after they had died, or in Joseph's case, after he was supposed to be dead. And both weren't recognized when they finally did appear. Next, Joseph was rightfully in charge of everything. It says, "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house and over my people, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.'" That's a lot like what we read already in Matthew 28:18, when Jesus said that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And they both not only had all authority given to them, but they handled it similarly. As head honcho, Joseph made sure that no one went hungry. And Jesus, in his authority, says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." So the guy with all the authority uses his authority for the benefit of others. Both Joseph and Jesus were given extreme authority and chose to use it with extreme generosity. The next way that Joseph looks a lot like Jesus is that people bowed in Joseph's presence. When his brothers showed up, Joseph's dream came true and they bowed in front of him. In Philippians 2:9 and 10 says about Jesus, "Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth." So Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. Both were loved by their father uniquely, hated by their brothers, falsely accused, sold for a little bit of silver, suffered with criminals, dead but then appeared alive, given authority and used it with generosity, and people bow in their presence. Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. But why do we talk about all that? What's the point? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, it helps to reveal that Jesus was not a blip on the historical timeline of humanity. He was not just this randomly born purpose who happened to be a savant of wisdom. He was not just a good teacher with good ideas that happened to live a few thousand years ago. He was God's plan all along. He was His plan in the beginning with Adam and Eve, His plan that was revealed in Noah's story, and His plan that has been revealed in the entire life story of Joseph. And the second reason we talk about it is because Jesus thought it was important to talk about. There were two men that were walking on a road to a town called Emmaus in the days after Jesus had died. It was rumored he had come back to life, but these guys weren't so sure, and they were sad, and they were talking about it, and Jesus appeared to them and joined them on their journey on the road to Emmaus. And it says that while he was walking with them, it says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Now, Moses wrote Genesis. So when it says that he began with Moses, he most certainly began in Genesis. And I can't imagine that he didn't bring up Joseph. There might not be a better story in the Bible that tells the story of Jesus, other than the story of Jesus, of course, but in the Old Testament, there may not be a better one than the story of Joseph. And as Jesus described to them how the stories in Genesis related to himself and how they tell Jesus' story, it says, they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" In other words, this is the best Bible study in the history of Bible studies. My prayer is that we have learned how these stories and Joseph's story today, how they point to Jesus. And my prayer is that as you've learned that, your heart burns within you. That you're struck with how amazing it is that God is so sovereign and so good that Jesus was the plan all along. And that you realize God's faithfulness throughout all of history that's never changed, not even in 2020. And not even to broken and messed up people like you and like me. God is still faithful. Next week, we're going to talk about Moses, the guy who wrote the book of Genesis. And I hope that you'll join us for that as we learn about his crazy story of being born and raised by Egyptians and ending up a murderer who talks to a fiery bush and then sets all of an entire enslaved nation of people free and leads them into the desert. It's a crazy story. We're going to try to tackle the entire thing in one message. So buckle up, but join us next week for the story of Moses. Let me close in a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the message of Joseph and of his story, and the message of Jesus that's revealed to us through Joseph's story. I pray that we would see how Jesus' story is told through our lives, to our neighbors, our coworkers, our family and friends, that somehow, some way, through our lives, Jesus' story would be told in a way that makes hearts burn for you. Help our hearts to burn just recognizing how faithful you are. In your name I pray. Amen. Stick around after this song and we'll have a time of prayer together.